the beautiful words about joy and peace and feasting in our text from Isaiah, Philippians, and the 23rd Psalm. Jesus' parable that we read in the Gospel of Matthew today is jarring. There's no doubt about it. Last week, we heard about the wicked tenants who hurt and killed the servants of the man who owned a vineyard, and then killed the man's son, thinking that they would inherit the vineyard. And then right after that, there's this story which is full of indifference and violence, perpetrated both by those who refused to come and by the king. At the end, there's a man who has been brought into the banquet. Remember, both good and bad were invited. But he is not wearing a wedding robe, so he gets thrown out. It seems there's not much good in this parable, and many scholars disagree about how to interpret it. Some people look at it as an allegory instead of a parable. You know what an allegory is? Each person and each event in an allegory represents only one person or one event, which makes it fairly easy to figure out. It's kind of like cracking a code. An allegorical way to look at this parable would be to say that the king must be God, the son must be Jesus, those who ignored and killed the messengers must be the Pharisees and others like them, and the man without the wedding robe is, well, and as we enter into an area there that defies easy explanation, let's talk about it. For some fiery preachers and law-heavy denominations, the man is someone who didn't adequately prepare for the banquet. By not putting on a wedding robe, by not dressing up, he is someone who didn't care enough to make the effort. Then it's easy to say that he doesn't belong, so it's understandable that he was just thrown out. And of course, that person would never be me. Or maybe, in my heart of hearts, I'm afraid that he is me, but I don't know what to do about it. And the biggest question with this interpretation is, what kind of God is this who behaves like this scary, vengeful, violent king? The colonial preacher Jonathan Edwards, who is best known for his sermon called Sinners in the Hands of an Angry God, would be very comfortable, or is it uncomfortable, with this kind of God. In contrast to an allegory, a parable usually has only one main point. Often, to force it to bear more than one point may strain it to the point of breaking. Some of my colleagues have another way to see this parable, and that is to see the violence of the king as human violence. In Matthew 11:12, Jesus says, "From the days of John the Baptist until now, the kingdom of heaven has suffered violence, and the violent take it by force. For John came neither eating nor drinking, and they say, he has a demon. The Son of Man came eating and drinking, and they say, look, a glutton and a drunkard, a friend of tax collectors and sinners." If the parable has one point, looking at it this way means that in Jesus' time, Jews were being compelled to recognize the authority of the Roman emperor. Those who didn't recognize his authority or who resorted to violence themselves were imprisoned and killed. And then a man came along who didn't allow either the Roman Empire or the Jewish leaders to influence him, who didn't behave as they thought he should behave, a man who came eating and drinking and made friends with tax collectors and sinners. He just didn't fit in. When Jesus is arrested near the end of Matthew's gospel, he is silent. If we imagine him confronted with the figurative question, "Friend, how did you get in here without a wedding robe?" he is speechless. If he responds to their accusations, it's to say something like, "So you say." And he ends up with his hands and feet bound to a rough cross and cast into the outer darkness, the darkness of death outside the city and outside this mortal life. The weeping and gnashing of teeth will be the agonized mourning of those who love him. I appreciate that interpretation and plan to spend more time meditating on its implications. But there's another interpretation of this parable that I feel is more important for us today. And in this case, the one point of the parable I want to focus on is the meaning of the wedding robe itself. Those good and bad people who've been invited and who wear wedding robes, and the man who was thrown out of the banquet for not wearing one. As far as I can tell, the first people who were invited, who were described by the king as not worthy, were not worthy only because they didn't come to the banquet. And about those who were worthy, all they had to do was show up. Some scholars explain that the cultural custom was to distribute wedding robes to the guests who arrived. So everyone would be clean and comfortable and presentable and would honor the bride and groom. They were all alike. As school-aged children who know the difference can tell us, there's a difference between attending a school where you exercise your freedom by wearing whatever you want to wear, and attending a school where uniforms are required. In a school where everyone wears uniforms, differences are not as obvious. If you have a home, if your parents have a job, if your parents make good money, all of those conditions can seem obvious by the clothes you wear. Not always, but sometimes. On the other hand, a uniform may make the path to a good education seem not quite as steep. You are starting from a similar place as all other students. And what kind of uniform or garment or robe do we wear as Christians? Well, we're all welcome to wear the garment of baptism, white all, like the one that I'm wearing. It represents the garment that from the time of the early church was put on by those who were newly baptized. It was probably very similar to the wedding robes worn by those who attended the wedding in the parable. But here's the important thing. We all wear a figurative garment of baptism because we are asked to wear it. Whether we have been judged or whether we judge ourselves to be good or bad, rich or poor, faithful or doubting, having many personal talents and resources, or very few. All that is required is that we show up, that we're willing to wear the robe and celebrate the feast that is shared with everyone. And if we remove the robe or refuse it in the first place so that we dishonor or deny the generosity of our host, we will be asked to leave. If it becomes important to us to flaunt our own expensive garments, we will be asked to leave. For the basic requirement is to acknowledge God's wild and abundant grace, and especially the feast for all that God throws to celebrate the ongoing reign of God's Son, Jesus. The wedding is the wedding between Christ and all of us. We have shown up, not quite knowing what to expect, because we aren't sure what it means to be worthy. But we're curious, and we have nothing better to do. We are washed, and we put on the wedding robe. The feasting is happening right now, and it's ongoing, and the invitation is always open. And with all God's people, we hear the promise so beautifully spoken in Isaiah. On this mountain, the Lord of hosts will make for all peoples a feast of rich food, a feast of well-aged wines, of rich food filled with marrow, or well-aged wine strained clear. And he will destroy on this mountain the shroud that is cast over all peoples, the sheet that is spread over all nations. He will swallow up death forever. Then the Lord God will wipe away the tears from all faces. Lo, this is our God. We have waited for him so that he might save us. This is the Lord for whom we have waited. Let us be glad and rejoice in his salvation. No more shrouds, but wedding robes. Wedding robes for all. Tell all your friends through word